everybody for being here. And I'm going to start and then pass it on to Katie. And Katie's going to talk a little bit more about herself and as well as the results of some research she has done related to this project. And in terms of my own positionality, this is a project that I'm coming at not as a researcher, but as a participant and a partner and someone that's very committed to this project. So I worked with this project when I was at World Wildlife Fund. But Katie then subsequently did some research on this project that she's going to share. So we're going to kind of talk from those two perspectives. And I just wanted to start by citing a commentary that Emilio Bruno recently passed around on his Twitter feed. And he mentioned this commentary from a student at another US university from Indonesia who lamented that US researchers tend to see the world of the tropics only through the lens of deforestation and orangutans in the case of Indonesia. And that struck a chord with me because when I was at World Wildlife Fund, there was a tension at times between a vision very much focused on the tropics are a store of biodiversity and we need to create large uninhabited blocks of preservation areas versus what I'm going to talk about today is working with land reform farmers in Bahia. Certainly that I think that argument has been superseded in World Wildlife Fund and around the time, in fact, of the beginning of the TCD program in the 1980s, there was a program at WWF called Wildlands for Human Needs. And then I started working there to develop a portfolio kind of like working forests. So, you know, I think there is still some remnants of this kind of vision of the tropics, but what I'm going to talk about today is a different way of seeing it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a project called the Jupara project, and it was developed in response to a conservation challenge, which is in the Atlantic forest. There are some endangered species. One of them is the golden-headed lion tamarin, where there was a biological reserve set aside to protect it that WWF had supported and expanded, and had done research on these animals. And wildlife researcher James Deach showed us that a minimum viable population of this animal would require about 4 times as much habitat as the reserve itself. And meanwhile, outside the reserve, there were land reform settlements occupying areas of forest. So the background of this project is to think about, to test really the theses that an agroecological approach to land reform could be viable. And we can discuss what that means, but the effectiveness of this approach to land reform and that it could be protective of forests. So those are kind of the two premises that we set out to test. Okay, and supported a project with the Jupara agroecological movement for about 10 years. It wasn't as smooth and integrated and a support as one might hope. There were 11 projects, 11 subcontract or grants over that time period. There were actually 6 program officers. I was the program officer that began the program, and then I became a program director supervising other program officers that supported this project. And it was conceived as a complement to protected areas that would support biodiversity and ecological services. And there was a target that we established in partnership, WWF and Jupara, of having 40% of land cover in agroforestry systems and 30% in forest, remnants of native forest. And together with Jupara, we articulated this conceptual model of the project that links agroecological production to environmental conservation, recognizing that you not only have to produce agroecologically, but you have to have organizational and collective work together as a group. You have to have commercialization. So this was kind of the model that was very much a synthesis of WWF's thinking and these proponents of this project. So it wasn't an imposed model, but you can still see some remnants of a colonial perspective here. Environmental conservation is the endpoint, and well-being is actually implicit, but it's not explicit as the goal. The goal is conservation through these other things that incorporated well-being. And this was the perspective of World Wildlife Fund, of a conservation organization. When I was managing programs in that organization, I always framed human development well-being as a necessary means to achieving the ultimate goal of World Wildlife Fund, which was the environmental conservation. More recently, these have become more integrated and not even separated as two different things, but that's the way we thought about it then. And these targets also were somewhat kind of, they were very much negotiated and incorporated because we had a very strong partnership. But you can see that these are kind of the WWF perspective, and like how we wanted to frame this and how we could frame it in a way that would provide the financial support that came from WWF, but in a way that was a collaborative with these folks. More recently, and this was back, as I said, until 2004, this project, I've had a chance to kind of revisit the project thanks to my friend Florencia Montagnini, who is a senior research scientist at Yale, has done a lot of work on agroforestry and is initiating or is leading a project related to biodiversity islands. She's writing a book and she invited me to contribute a chapter, which this presentation is a draft of, and welcome your contributions to how to make it better. So this is kind of an opportunity to kind of rethink and reanalyze what we did back in that day. And so just to give you a little bit more background before I pass it on to Katie. So we're talking about the Atlantic forest of Brazil, and the Atlantic forest has two major areas where there's a lot of remnant forest. There's a Serra do Mar, which historically was an area of steep topography between the coast where colonization arrived and the plateau where major cities like Curitiba and Sao Paulo are. And the kind of development kind of went over the Serra do Mar and left a lot of forest remnants. Here in southern Bahia, the Cacao region, there was a lot of forest remnants, not for the lack of human occupation, but because of the kind of human occupation. The human occupation or development of this area was based on cacao harvesting and cultivation. And cacao in the Atlantic forest is an agroforestry product, and it is often grown under the native forest overstory. So it's an understory tree. Here on the left, it's below rubber trees. So you can have a more, two cultivars, in this case, rubber as an overstory and cacao, but often it's in a much more complex native forest system. Okay, and in terms of the history of this region and the development of cacao, up to about 1820, this region had very little Western European occupation. It was mountainous. It had indigenous resistance, and it started to be occupied, and there was a major period called the Desbravadores, kind of started to arrive in this region in the 1800s, and then from up to about 1930, you had the period of the Coronéis, who created large estates using the Capruca mechanism with cacao in the understory of the native forest. Jorge Amado, great novels about this period, Terras do Sem Fim. And the most important point is, with history going on, in the 1990s, there was a crisis of this crop in this region, partly because there had been expanded new cultivars in Indonesia, Ecuador, West Africa, that caused the price to go down because of the exchange rate and because of some disease. Okay, now switching to the link then to the land reform social movement. So this is a social movement that began in this region and throughout Brazil throughout the 1970s. In the 1990s, there were many families that were being settled throughout the country, 500,000. The most important fact about land reform in this period, that it was unplanned, conflictive. 95% of the settlements were areas that had been occupied, and then later the government came and regularized them. And the government, because of there was political pressure, was interested in meeting numerical targets, but they weren't giving technical assistance, credit, or infrastructure. And because it was so conflicted, that meant very clearly that this occupation occurred in remote areas, poor soils, areas of forest that would be less defended by the, for example, the cacao barons. And that led to deforestation and poverty because they were in poor soils. Okay. So now just to get you started about the project, these are the folks that we in World Wildlife Fund collaborated with. We have on the left and the far left and the right, two amazing extension leaders from the region who were promoting this model of agroecological land reform, Mera and Louison. And then Andre Katisha, who's next to Mera on the left and in the middle picture, was one of about 10 different community leaders who participated in this agroecological movement. And they worked in communities throughout the cacao region. So here is Ilhéus, which was the main port of the cacao export. And they worked in 35 communities and 17 municipalities throughout this region. So there were leaders, a group of leaders from various different communities. There were different kinds of leaders. There was Dona Neuza was a social worker, healthcare leader. Boinho was a rural union organizer. Katisha was a person from a traditional community. And this project in these 35 communities had different types of communities. So one of them were called the traditional communities that had been occupied for a long period of time. These were quilombos, which were areas that had been refuges of escaped slaves and that had been occupied for time. And so that's one type of community. They call those the traditional communities. And Katisha is from Lagoa Santa, is one of those. Katie's going to actually talk about one community of each type here. So then the agrarian reform happened, and the community of Fortaleza is a typical example. And they had to settle in these distant forested areas that they basically had to convert to any kind of livelihoods through slash and burn agriculture and or agroforestry. And then because of that conflict in the cacao, or because of the crisis in the cacao economy, in the mid-1990s, the cacao estates started becoming available to land reform. So there was kind of a switch in the late 1990s from this conflictive model of land reform to land reform where former occupants of cacao estates as laborers became owners because the owners wanted to sell out because of the problems that they had with the disease and the low prices, etc. So Katie will talk about Cascata, which is a community that was a land reform settlement, but in a cacao estate. So it's not this contested kind of a model. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to my former master's student, Katie Painter.
Hello, everyone. So like Bob was saying, we kind of a number of years after he had done this work with WWF, I had the opportunity as part of my master's research to visit 3 of these communities. We did a bunch of interviews and kind of with the purpose of knowing, you know, how well the extension work that WWF had supported had stuck over the long term, and were people using the techniques that they had been taught, and were they, you know, conserving forest as was part of the plan that he'd mentioned. So in summer of 2005, I went there and did all these interviews, and I'm going to talk about some of the results that we found. But first, Bob wanted me to talk a little bit about what I've been up to since then, since it's been quite a number of years since I went down there and did that work. So I, soon after graduating with my master's, moved out here to Boise, Idaho, where I got offered this job coordinating a refugee farm program. And at that time, the Office for Refugee Resettlement had some funding to support farming and agriculture for refugees who'd been resettled in different cities around the country. So this work was happening not just here in Boise, but in a number of other places. And I mostly worked with people from East Africa, but from a smattering of different places all over the world. Refugees, if you guys don't know, are a very specific class of immigrants that come, and they usually come from conflict zones around the world. And after usually spending some time in a refugee camp or in a country adjacent to their country that can't support them over the long term, they can be permanently resettled to the United States or a number of other countries. So the people that I've been working with had all arrived here under that program and had farming backgrounds. And for a while, refugee resettlement workers had recognized that community gardens were really beneficial to those folks, both in terms of better health, physical and mental health outcomes for them, and just having access to some foods that are hard to get at stores. So I kind of took a community garden program and developed it into more of an incubator farm, where you can see on the picture on the right, it was grew to be pretty large scale. That's about 2 acres of vegetable crops they have there, which was out in back of a church where we were able to borrow some land. And then we did a lot of farmers market and CSA marketing. And so that could almost be its own presentation. I don't want to say too much about it, except to say that, there are a bunch of these projects around the countries, and staff come and go. So if that's the kind of thing that people are interested in after graduating, that there are some job opportunities, and I'd be happy to talk more about it at a later time. So can I see the next slide, Bob? So then I ended up leaving that project last year, and what I'm mostly doing now is doing curriculum development and training of trainers for those similar kinds of projects. And so I am currently at this organization called ISED Solutions, and at their webpage you can see some examples of my work and our team's work. And so this was one that I did last year. I also had the opportunity to do some work with American Farmland Trust, as was mentioned in the intro. And so they had done this nationwide curriculum around land tenure and finding land for beginning farmers, which is a big challenge for new farmers here in the US. And so I took some of their work and kind of translated it into a version that was more user-friendly for people with lower literacy in English or at all. And so that involved taking a very, wordy kind of academic set of materials and adding more visuals and just simplifying the language and things so people could use. And so this year we're doing more of photo and video development that people who don't read and write as much in English can learn from. And I have about 10 partners around the country that I'm working with to continue to develop these materials. So that's kind of what I'm up to now. And then can I see the next one, Bob? So then this gets back to our work in Bahia. And so one of our goals was to figure out which of the agroecological practices folks had been taught that they were actually using. So down here across the bottom, we have the things that the extensionists went out and kind of taught them about and worked with them. So it's things like using green manures and several different kinds of natural fertilizers, composting, not using agrochemicals, crop rotation, mulching, and stuff like that, and then eliminating the burning of their fields. So there's a lot of bars going on here, but if you guys can see the light, so this represents 2 different communities. Lagoa Santa was the traditional Quilombo community, and then Fortaleza was one of the resettlement, more recent communities. And so the light blue shows the participants from Lagoa Santa, or the non-participants, sorry, and the dark blue, the participants, and then Fortaleza, the light green are the non-participants and the dark green are the participants. So within any community, people kind of had a choice whether or not to interact with this project that came. And, some people chose to be a part of the project and some people didn't. And even the people who didn't were very gracious when I was there and letting me interview them and give some information so that we could compare the two groups, right? And so you can see that, you know, for some of those, maybe we want to look at the next slide. Bob, do you still have those lists on the next slide?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, so let's look at that one. Not this one, the previous one.
Well.
Uh-oh. You can't go back. So what we basically found out was that some of the practices were used by almost everyone, and that including multi-cropping, crop rotation, and mulching. And that could mean that people were doing these things already before the Jupara project came, and those are just traditional practices in that area already. It could mean that, you know, the practices were so useful or easy to use or whatever that they were learning from each other. And we found that a lot of people use them, and there wasn't a big difference between whether people had participated in the project or not. Then there was a list that almost no one used, including the green manure and some of the homemade fertilizers, such as liquid and compost fertilizer. And, you know, there could be a number of reasons for that. I've been at this point teaching farmers for a long time and think that green manures are both one of the most important practices to implement and also one of the more logistically difficult practices to get people to actually do, just because the timing on it can be really tricky. You got to get them there in between other crops that you're growing. And honestly, I don't know that there are very many choices that would work as well in these systems that are super shady. Usually those are used more with row crops or agroforestry systems that are more spread out. Like, as you could kind of see from Bob's pictures, like the cacao systems are pretty darn shady, and they don't like till the green manures. You know, it'd be hard to till them in. Like, there's a bunch of logistical reasons why that might not work well, so that wasn't happening. And then, you know, there was this other list of the ones that the participants used more than the non-participants. And so we could kind of see an effect from the Jupara extension as having been there. And so they had their own kind of commercial fertilizer that they were distributing, and some people were using that as opposed to chemical fertilizers. Fewer of them were using agrochemicals of any kind. And then they were implementing these contour erosion strips, which, you know, were quite a bit of work to do, and took some technical skills to do. So that one in particular kind of showed that the extensionists had done a good job in, you know, teaching a difficult practice and getting people to implement it and use it over the long term. Okay, so let's see the next one. All right, so then this one talks about, again, in Fortaleza and Lagoa Santa, participants and non-participants, and whether they had met those goals of 30% of the land being in forest and 40% being in agroforestry. And so with Fortaleza, you can see that, you know, they're around a little more than half maybe of people being able to do that. And there's actually more non-participants doing it than participants. So it doesn't, you know, say too much about the program itself making a difference and whether or not people would do that. And then we see in Lagoa Santa that almost all of the people have a high percentage of their landholding in agroforestry, but very little of it in native, you know, Mata Atlantica forest. So there's a lot of things that are interesting about this. So we go back one more, Bob.
Right.
Oh no. Okay, so for Fortaleza, they were a newer settlement, but they had this strange thing happen where a bunch of people, like after being there for, I don't know, 15 years or something, that they were all on land that had never been kind of officially delineated and titled. And so the government agency that came in and did that process a long time later, like moved some of those people from the spot they had been in to a spot that was completely forested. And they had no choice but to begin deforesting that area in order to grow anything really. And so those results were a little bit skewed by that process having happened in the middle of when, you know, the Jupara project sort of also happened. And then for Lagoa Santa, you know, there is very little forest remnants still left there. And I think that since that community had been there for a long time, probably there wasn't much forest at the beginning of the project. So I think, you know, we were asking them to kind of conserve something that didn't really exist in the first place. And, you know, as Bob mentioned, this project happened not just in the few communities I visited, but in 35 communities. And so to come up with like a blanket set of goals for all those communities without knowing a lot about each one, or even knowing anything about each individual farmer within each one, is difficult. And so I think, you know, in this sense, we learned that maybe the goals hadn't been met, but we also learned that the goals might have not made a huge amount of sense in the first place, or had been affected by some of these externalities, such as the INCRA delineation of the properties that happen sometime later. Okay, let's see what's on the next one. Okay, so then this was land use change in Fortaleza, and shoot, my strip of faces here is covering some of my things, so I can't actually see the whole thing. Sorry, I'm not like that great about Zoom over here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so go away, people's faces. All right, so this one tells about just Fortaleza, which was the one that was kind of changed around, you know, midway. And so this, we had some maps and things that were connected to this data, but basically showing the dark green is the percent change in forest, the lighter tan is the percent change in agroforestry or regrowth, and then the tan is the change in cleared. And so ideally we'd like to be seeing, of course, the amount of forest increasing over time, the amount of new agroforestry systems or forest regrowth increasing, and then the amount of cleared land going down, which in the first two groups we see that. So the participants, it looks like, are having more of an increase in the amount of forest on their land than the non-participants. And then this one in the middle that kind of throws the whole thing off is the new lots, which was where people were moved from where they had been onto some forest reserve area, you know, obviously had to decrease their forest, increase the amount of cleared land, and then, you know, wait for whatever they planted there. I mean, there wasn't really a lot of row crops or anything happening anywhere in this area. Like, it was mostly their goals were agroforestry, but it takes a while for that to kind of get up to speed. So that was what was happening in that one in the middle. And then, you know, the community reserve was deforested a little bit over time. So I don't know, this isn't my favorite graph because I think that one in the middle throws it off a little bit, but that's about what we found. And then what's on the next one, Bob?
I think it's back to me.
Is it back to you? Okay.
All right. Thanks, Katie.
You're welcome.
It was an amazing thesis that you did, because you did a lot of analyses at a lot of different levels. So you dug in terms of the Landsat imagery for the details at Fortaleza, but you started with that overview. And then you also did another chapter about Cascata, the cacao reserve that we haven't shown any results of here yet. The land reform settlement that was made out of cacao estate. But I'm going to talk about that in a second. But just to kind of then coming back to our conceptual model and the kind of the thesis, is land reform viable and does it protect the forest? And this on the left here is the conceptual model that we used to develop the project. And since I've had this opportunity, thanks to Florencia, to kind of step back and look at it again, and using this lens of biodiversity islands. Well, one thing that I realize now that I hadn't thought about at the time was how much the results were driven by external factors. So the occupation system first. Lagoa Santa gave you one set of results, Fortaleza gave you another set of results in the conflictive land reform, and then Cascata, the cacao estates that had been turned into land reform, gave you a totally different. So kind of looking at a project is great, but if you don't understand that broader system that's in it, and if you don't have an opportunity to influence that broader system, then how much you can influence at the level of the project is limited. And I guess being at UF and TCD, I've kind of broadened my understanding, I think, in that sense. So just to kind of drill into then those three cases of Lagoa Santa, which is where Katisha is from, Fortaleza, which is the conflictive agrarian reform, and Cascata, which I'm calling a negotiated land reform, because there are willing sellers and the government compensated the landowners. And so the Quilombo community goes back to the 1800s. The Fortaleza was originally colonized in the mid-1970s. And when it was colonized, it was all forest. So it was colonized by a land reform movement, later regularized by INCRA, but they were occupying forest. And in a way, I think that now that I have this broader perspective, Lagoa Santa is kind of the long-term end game of what Fortaleza is the beginning of a process. You occupy a forest, and in the future you get to some place where, for example, over many generations, you're going from the 70s, well, you're going from something over a few decades to something over many decades. The land holdings subdivided among families. So the average land holding was 22 hectares is down to 9 hectares. But these communities are rather similar in that they're both isolated. And now comparing it to Cascata, it's more recent. The land holding is actually fairly small. It's on a major highway, and it's got fertile soils. Whereas both Lagoa Santa and Fortaleza are closer to the coast, the soils are poor. It's rather isolated, very hilly. So in Cascata, the production system is basically cacao. In Fortaleza, it's diversified, and in Lagoa Santa, it's even more diversified. They're both agroforestry-based systems, but you have many more products, many more. Later on, the percent of income from farming is actually a little bit lower in Lagoa Santa. So both Fortaleza and Cascata live primarily from farming. Lagoa Santa, smaller land holdings, more people who are retired have other income sources or maybe going out to work. So it's kind of a later stage where it's less dependent on agriculture. But then these next two rows are really interesting. So as Katie showed, the percent of natural forest in Lagoa Santa with the project or without the project is very low. But the amount of agroforestry is very high. And so Fortaleza is kind of in the middle of, they've cleared some of their forest to invest in agroforestry. They still have a good bit of forest left, although it's not equally distributed among the different landowners. And in Cascata, you have a major forest remnant in one part of it, and a lot of it is an established cacao. So the tendency for the future in Lagoa Santa is to maintain and expand the agroforestry. In Fortaleza, it's also to expand the agroforestry. Some of the private lands, especially the ones that are in the project, were increasing the amount of forest regrowth, and some of those were in areas of connectivity along water courses between, your map shows that, Katie, which we didn't show today. And then the tendency in Cascata is basically maintenance. Okay, so given that, this is kind of the final kind of a more systemic view then. So if you have this initiative to promote agroecological land reform, and you're trying to take a systemic view because you're linking production, organization, and commercialization, and how that affects the use of the natural resources and the protection of the forest. One major driver, though, is the kind of occupation, whether it's where you're occupied and what that process is, how long it is. So then if we look kind of more broadly at the macro factors, the history, the biophysical conditions, which were favorable in Cascata, unfavorable in Fortaleza and Lagoa Santa, the public policies, which are in one level promoting land reform, but at the other level, they're not providing much in the way of technical assistance or et cetera. The logistics, Cascata's right on a major road, the other places are hard to get at, the markets and so on. So this kind of, today I'm looking at it in a much more systemic way. Okay, and so that's kind of the conclusion about the what we found in these from the data that Katie collected and the experience of working in these communities, and just the opportunity to relook at it. I'm like, wow, it was really good that we designed this study along these 3 communities, because we just kind of tried to pick representative communities, but it turned out that really that was like almost a determining factor. And by looking at all 3 of them, we could really get a big picture of this total dynamic. So I just wanted to just share an update about, so I've been friends with these people and check in with them more or less every year. I've actually have have established some roots in this region. I'm so in love not only with these people in this region that basically I'm creating a second home there. And so I'm still friends with these folks, and and Andrei Katisha, to me, he's retired now, more or less, but he's kind of the ideal example of what we wanted to accomplish in terms of land reform nowadays. If you go to his land, he has had quite a bit of government support. First of all, he's been recognized as a Quilombo, so that gives them certain amount of rights, and it also gives them access to government support. So they have, he has an extended family that lives together in like a compound where there are actually 6 concrete houses that were built by the government. They were, concrete houses as opposed to, stucco and mud houses is a definite advance. They weren't great houses, but now they can invest in them over time. They got support, and here you can see an irrigation system. And so they grow greens, and they take them to the community market every Saturday. So the whole family works together. So they have a group of houses and the extended family works together. So the idea initially of working organization and community development works really well here. But given that they're all relatives, it's an extended family. So you can see in the immediate background, some of his agroforestry system. He has many different plots with many different types of agroforestry system. The far background is a neighbor that has a little bit more clearing and some grazing. He doesn't have any of that. He's got all kinds of agroforestry. And the family is fairly prosperous. They have 1 or more cars, they have motorcycles, they all have cell phones, of course. And, they're getting education. His daughter is now the head of the association. So there is a community association, but it's very family centric. So he's not alone, but I don't exactly know how they fit in with the broader group. Okay, Mera. Mera was the extension agent, essentially, the leader. She did a tremendous work with gender and community organization and empowerment. And she decided, well, if I believe in this so much, and I think this is really incredible, said, well, I'm going to become a land reform settler. So she's actually a settlee in the Projeto de Assentamento Frei Ventuí, which is one of the former cacao estates. And it happens to be on the road very close to Ilhéus and Itabuna, which brings some disadvantages actually, because people have an incentive to go work in the city and not work on the land. So she's, I would say, she's a leader in the community, and they're doing a lot of interesting things, but it's a struggle. So they are accessing projects and public policies. They're doing a lot of work on collective action, social participation, but I know that there's also a lot of conflict within the community. Different religious groups get along or don't get along. So there's definitely factions that she has to deal with, but they are doing some interesting things with diversification. So not just cacao, they're improving the cacao, but they're expanding to other agroforestry products or crops. They have a forest reserve, and they're reforesting some of the degraded areas, and they have some initiatives related to commercialization. And Louison continues. He was the kind of the main agro production system, ecological approach. He has very much of a systems approach. He continues. He's a small farmer on himself, and he kind of lives from multiple products that he manages, and then he continues to work in various communities, including extending to the Caatinga, the drylands of Bahia. He's helping communities dialogue with INCRA, the government agency. He has some alliances with some political leaders. All of us together have a WhatsApp group that doesn't do a whole lot, but it's kind of maintaining the coherence of this group. And future questions for research. Well, of course, Katie only did one master's thesis, so there's a lot more that we could analyze in terms of follow-up and economic analysis in terms of viability. But some bigger questions that are exciting to me, and I think are challenging to think about, are these urban-rural linkages. If Lagoa Santa only has 45% of their income from farming, how else are they interacting? And their role in terms of community markets and the local supply chains, you know, mobility and education and different things like that. And then seeing farming as part of a diversified livelihood strategy, which Katie has pointed out to me that only a very, very small percentage of American farmers live only on farming, and most of them have another income source. So I will stop there. I'm happy to answer any other questions, or probably have questions for Katie, or you'd like to hear more about her other adventures.